Hey, it's nice to spend Easter together, right? After last year not getting to. This is really, really lovely. I'm really excited about it. Jesus is standing next to this massive temple in the middle of Jerusalem, and it's 150 feet tall. It's like 15 stories tall. The south side of this temple is over 900 feet long. It's made of these stones, some of which are 45 feet long and weigh over 600 tons. And he stands in front of this massive temple in Jerusalem, and he says, if you destroy this temple, I will raise it again in 3 days. The people there start to lose their minds. Like, it took 46 years to build that temple. There's no way you're going to build it back up after just 3 days. But he isn't talking about this temple. He's talking about his body. If you destroy this, I'll raise it again. I'll rebuild it in 3 days. But that to them would have seemed even crazier than saying that he could rebuild something that took 46 years. So the possibility that he's talking about his body doesn't even enter into their imaginations. They can only focus on the building. You see, in Jesus' time, just as in ours, there were thoughts about death. There was this idea that everyone dies and dead things stay dead. That's just the way the world works. And so today, this Easter weekend, I would like to spend a few moments meditating together on the possibility that resurrection is the antidote to all kinds of death. Now, this last year, the last 12 months for me, and I assume for you as well, have been a weird and strange 12 months. We've been living through a pandemic. We've been living in quarantine. Even now, those of you who are here are staring up at me with sunglasses and masks. Like, nothing about this year has been normal. Now, occasionally there's been these little blips of goodness, these blips of being able to kind of forget what an insane and crazy year it is, but then those are often interrupted as the reality that we are living through comes rushing back, sometimes with a wave of emotion that crashes over us. A couple of months ago, I was helping my 8-year-old son, Jack, with a homework project that he had, and he was supposed to every day that week watch a short video about someone who had influenced the world, either an entertainer or a sports player, and he was supposed to write a little summary of the video about how that person influenced the world. And so I thought, well, that sounds like an easy project. I really like it when his mom takes the harder ones, but I could totally watch a video and help him come up with some sentences. And so I sat down with him, and he pulled up the slide of the first video we were supposed to watch together. And we had been having a pretty good week. I hadn't been thinking a lot about the weird last year we've had. And the very first slide, he pulls it up. And the person he's supposed to watch a video about is Kobe Bryant. And for me, and perhaps for you, this last year was when I think about the pandemic and all the bad things starting, this was kind of what kicked things off. Like the death of Kobe Bryant in early 2020. And look, I didn't know Kobe personally at all, and I assume he was definitely not a perfect man, but I grew up watching Kobe Bryant play. And there was something about seeing him, like I saw his whole career from the time that he was, a rookie who was way too confident in his own abilities, airballing 4 times against the Utah Jazz in the playoffs, to the time where he was winning NBA championships. And so as soon as the slide came up and we had to watch this video, I thought, oh man, I'm getting emotional. Like, I don't want to lose it here in front of my son. I'm hoping that we're okay. So we press the play button, and it's actually fine. This is just a very fact-based video about where Kobe grew up and how many championships and MVPs he won. It's that kind of thing. So I'm fine. No tears in front of my 8-year-old son. Everything's good. I don't want to destroy his life or make him think that his dad can't handle it. So he goes down to the next slide, and I think that's going to be the slide where we answer the question. But instead, the next slide is another short video, and it's Kobe's video called Dear Basketball. This is the one that he won an Oscar film for. He created as he was leaving the NBA. It's a love letter to the game of basketball. And as the video rolls along, I'm starting to feel more and more emotional, but I think I'm going to be okay. And then it gets toward the end of the video, and they go picture in picture, and I didn't realize the version that they had uploaded and used was the version where Kobe Bryant, was getting his number retired as a Laker, and they played it on the Jumbotron at Staples Center before he walked out, and it shows him in the tunnel watching the video as he walks out to all this applause. And I'll just be honest with you, whether it was because of Kobe or because of the year we had or whatever, I just got hit with a wave of emotion, and I just started to lose it. I was just sobbing there in front of my 8-year-old son, Jack. And Jack said, Dad, are you okay? And I said, buddy, I am okay. it's just been a hard year. I grew up watching Kobe, and I began to tell him about Kobe highlights and things that I love. I told him about Kobe's last game where he scored 60 points. I was in Pennsylvania. It was like 2 o'clock in the morning. I was up to watch that thing live, and I was jumping up and down, couldn't believe it was going to end that perfectly. And I just told him, it's just been tough, right? It's been tough, and I've had a hard time. So we write the paper, and it's okay, and my son has a lot of grace for me. The next day, I help him with the next person. The next entertainer is Chadwick Boseman. Now, Chadwick Boseman is an actor who also passed away last year. He had cancer, and Jack saw him, and I was like, oh, that's Chadwick Boseman. He played the Black Panther in the Marvel movies. Jack, you remember the Black Panther? He's like, oh, I love that. I said, yeah, he also passed away toward the end of last year. But I didn't have that emotional connection with Chadwick Boseman that I did with Kobe. I hadn't watched him my whole life. It was very sad for me, obviously, but I just wasn't overwhelmed with waves of emotion or anything. I'm just about to play the video for us to watch, and Jack puts his hand on top of mine and looks me in the eyes, and he says, Dad, before we watch this, are you going to cry a lot again? And I said, no, I'm not going. Don't be ridiculous. I said, Jack, man, it's just been a hard year. I got pretty emotional yesterday. But, things have been tough. We've been thrown completely out of our balance. Like, we don't have a rhythm anymore. And so I'm a little bit more raw. I'm a little bit more on edge than normal. And he said, Dad, it has been hard. And then he said, Dad, will things ever get good again? Loaded question, tons behind it. And what my 8-year-old son essentially was asking is, what is the nature of the world? Is the world a cold, hard, dead place? Is it a world where death has the last word? Is it a world where everything that looks good is actually just a small blip on the radar, a miniature interruption into what is ultimately leading toward death and destruction and chaos, and that's where things are headed? Because if that's the kind of world we live in, then perhaps the only reasonable response to it is cynicism. Or is the world different than that? You see, it's not a new question, but it's a question that my son was essentially asking through what he asked. It's a question that people have been wrestling with for thousands and thousands of years. What is the nature of the world? Is the world a cold, hard, dead place? The oldest fictional story that we have on record is the Epic of Gilgamesh. We have a lot of different versions and copies of it, but I want to give you just kind of an overview of what the story looks like, and it changes a bit depending on which version you look at. But Gilgamesh essentially was this king. He was the ruler of a town called Uruk, and he was his father was a king and his mother was a god. And so his mom was a god, his father was a human king. They had this child Gilgamesh. And so we're told in the story that Gilgamesh is 1/3 human and 2/3 god. Don't think too hard about the math on that. It doesn't quite pan out. That's just what the story says, which means that Gilgamesh is very powerful and he can be this king. When we find him at the beginning of the story, he is not a good dude. Like he uses his power to prey on the weakest of people. He's not good. But he is disturbed because he recognizes that while he is greater than most of the mortals around him, he is still mortal, which means he will still die. There is a mortality built into who he is that is troubling to him. The gods don't like that Gilgamesh has so much power, so they create a being and they send this being down. It's a wild animal called Enkidu, and Enkidu goes and grapples with Gilgamesh, and they have this fight, and they end up, Gilgamesh ends up winning. But instead of killing Enkidu, he and Enkidu actually become quite close. They become friends. In fact, they decide to team up together to deal with some of the monsters that are in the kingdom, and so they have these adventures together. But eventually the gods decide that Enkidu is an abomination, and he hasn't done what he's supposed to do, so he's also a failure. So the gods conspire together to kill Enkidu, and this sends Gilgamesh spiraling. His friend is dead, and he, as 1/3 human, is mortal as well. He will die eventually, and so he decides to go on this journey, and he is going to meet the only man who he knows is immortal. There's a man named Utnapishtim who he goes to see, and Utnapishtim has been granted immortality by the gods as a reward. You see, the story, and again, it's one of the oldest ones that we have recorded. The story is that the gods decided, because they were finished with human beings, that they were going to flood the earth and destroy everything. But one of the gods goes and tells Utnapishtim that that's the plan and that's going to happen. And it gives him time to build a giant boat and get all of his family together inside of this boat, along with a bunch of animals, so that the whole planet can be repopulated again after these flood waters recede and after the world is restored to the way it was before. The gods are thankful that Utnapishtim does this. In fact, they're so thankful because after they flood the earth, they regret having done it. They decide that they were really just kind of having a temper tantrum. They'll never do that again. And so to reward Utnapishtim for saving the human race and for saving all these animals, they decide to give him immortality. He's given a life that'll last forever. And so within the story, we see Gilgamesh decides to go and speak with Utnapishtim, and he wants to ask him, what is the key to immortality? What can I do to get it? What does it look like to never have to die? Because that's the thing that bothers me. I don't want to die. Utnapishtim tells him that you are immortal, and it is the state of mortals that they will die, that their life will not go on forever. You really need to come to terms with that fact. Gilgamesh is essentially asking throughout this entire story, what is the nature of the world? What is the nature of the world? Is the world a cold, hard, dead place? Does death win in the end? Are all the good things we see in the world really just blips on the radar, small pieces that we can put together and say like, oh, maybe life is good, but it's really just all a facade. And see, this is what Gilgamesh determines after talking with Utnapishtim. Death is inescapable. There's no one who's going to get away from it. Jesus had ancestors, ancient Israelites who also were concerned with precisely what would happen after one died. Precisely were concerned with what would happen. Like, is everyone going to die? And this is what they came up with. We see this in Ecclesiastes, some of the wisdom literature we find in the Hebrew Bible. They write this: everyone will die someday. Death comes to godly and sinful people alike. It comes to good and bad people alike. It comes to clean and unclean people alike. And those who offer sacrifices and those who don't offer them also die. You see, the question for the author of Ecclesiastes and for these ancient Israelites was the question that lots of people ask, is what is the nature of the world? Is the world a cold, hard, dead place? And they decide that, look, death is inescapable. That's just the way it goes. Now, for ancient Israelites, they actually weren't afraid of death. They were just more angry about death, bitter about the fact of death. In fact, that Ecclesiastes passage goes on to say this: here's what is so bad about everything that happens on this earth. Like, you want to know a secret? Here's why life is terrible. Because death catches up with all of us. Also, the hearts of people are full of evil. They live in foolish pleasure. After that, they join those who have already died. Anyone who is still living has hope. Even a live dog is better off than a dead lion. Now, I'd rather be a dog than any type of cat anyway, because cats just seem angry and bitter all the time. But in the day that this was written, dogs were seen as absolute disgusting mongrel animals. Like they were not to be envied at all. And so he's saying like that dog, this being that we basically really look down on, it would be better to be alive as a dog than to be dead as the king of the jungle. It's as if the author is saying that, yes, death is inescapable. You know what? Also, that's a bummer. It stinks that death is inescapable. But here's something else that the ancient Israelites, that Jesus' ancestors recognize as well. There's a death that can happen while you still have a pulse. You can die while still having your heart beat. You can die while still drawing breath in your body. They had a few ways of thinking about that kind of death. They said that death is essentially when you stop seeking wisdom. When you stop seeking wisdom, there's a kind of death that happens in you. We read this in the book of Ecclesiastes. It says, for the protection of wisdom is like the protection of money, and the advantage of knowledge is that wisdom preserves the life of him who has it. So there's a double meaning here, right? Like in one sense, you can't continue to live throughout your life without some amount of wisdom. That's the thing that keeps you going from one day to the next. You need wisdom in order to navigate the difficulties of life. But also, when one stops seeking wisdom, one stops truly living. That's the message that we see in Ecclesiastes. So death is when you take your last breath, but death is also when you stop seeking wisdom, and death is when you stop praising God. The psalmist writes it this way in Psalm 106, "Turn, Lord, and deliver me. Save me because of your unfailing love. Among the dead, no one proclaims your name. Who praises you from the grave?" If you can't praise God anymore, then you're not really living, whether you have a pulse or not. See, there's a death that can happen while you still have a pulse. And for many of us, we're kind of aware of this. I believe I was in 7th grade in Mr. Montgomery's math class. He taught algebra, and we were taking it ahead of some of our classmates. I had some friends of ours who we could choose to be in this advanced placement program. And I'd never taken anything like algebra before. And I remember toward the end of the first semester, we were studying and we were talking about, basically imaginary numbers and impossible numbers and different calculations. And someone finally said, like, hey, what is the point of us knowing any of this? And I remember Mr. Montgomery said, because it'll be on the test, which was very inspiring and led me toward a lifetime of learning. And so we were studying this new stuff and we're trying to figure it out and trying to understand it. And then I remember him saying, hey, you want to be careful here, because this is the first class you're taking that you're going to get some high school credit for, which means it's going to go on your permanent transcript. I'd never heard the phrase permanent transcript until that point, but it sounded pretty frightening. I was like, what is this about? And you get to high school and you find out, oh, your permanent transcript is important because that tells you which college you'll get into, along with your ACT and your SAT scores. So you need to be careful about your permanent transcript. And then we get out of high school and into college, and they tell us, you know what? You need to make sure you work really hard because some businesses will probably want to look at your GPA, or you need to get the right internships because some people won't hire you if you haven't had the right experience. And so we just go through life constantly trying to move on to the next thing and do the next thing, and finally find ourselves in a job. And someone comes and they show us where our desk is, or where our work site is, or where we're supposed to go, or how we're supposed to behave. And we start to understand by looking at other people who are getting elevated throughout the organization, like what it looks like to get a promotion and to get a raise. And so we start trying to do those things. And all that works pretty well until at some point you're stuck in traffic trying to get to your job, or you're sitting at your desk in a meeting on Zoom one afternoon, or you're lying in bed at night and this existential thud just hits your chest. And you start to ask, what is the point of all of this? Do I even like this vocation that I've been preparing for, working at so hard? Is this even giving me life? See, for many of us, our entire lives, someone's told us, you know what? If you want to get from here to there, you need to climb that ladder. Okay, well, I can climb that ladder. And now that you're here, if you want to get from here to there, you need to climb this other ladder. Okay, and so for some of us, we got really good at climbing ladders. And we determined that the type of ladder that we would climb would differ depending on the situation, right? So some ladders, like romantic ladders, you have to do like a promposal or something like that. There's a way to get to the next level, and you have to make sure that it's really good. If your proposal doesn't make, 10,000 hits on YouTube, you probably are doing it wrong. Or for some, it's just hardworking, or it's learning how to be really efficient in the job you do. For some, it's brainstorming new ideas or solving hard problems. There's all these different ladders that we can climb depending on the circumstances, but most of us were never required to take a class in high school or in college to determine whether that ladder we're climbing is even against the right building. And so sometimes we're still breathing, we still have a pulse, there's still blood pumping through our body, and yet we come to a place in our life where we feel a little bit dead inside. And we start to ask the question, did I marry the right person? Should I have had this many kids? Do I even enjoy this vocation? Why am I so tired all the time? Why am I so anxious all the time? Why do I dread getting up every single morning? There's a way to die while you still have a pulse. And the question is, what is the nature of the world? Is this just as good as it gets? That I'm going to die while I still have a pulse and then die again and not have a pulse anymore? Is that where all this is headed? Is the world a cold, hard, dead place? Jesus' ancestors believed that the reason that God was because he had power over the death cycle. that God had a power that human beings didn't. And so God speaks to the prophet Hosea, and he says to him, I will deliver this people from the power of the grave. I will redeem them from death. Where, O death, are your plagues? Where, O grave, is your destruction? In other words, like this death problem that you're worried about in this life and in the one to come, I have power over that. I can reverse that. I can change it. And if that weren't enough, he takes the prophet Ezekiel and he takes him out to this valley. And we pick this up in Ezekiel 37, this story. And Ezekiel writes, the hand of the Lord was on me, and he brought me out by the Spirit of the Lord. And he set me in the middle of a valley, and it was full of bones. He led me back and forth among them, and I saw a great many bones on the floor of the valley, bones that were very dry. And he asked me, Son of man, can these bones live? And I said, Sovereign Lord, you alone know. Now, he doesn't say you alone know because he's not sure if God is capable. Ezekiel is very confident that, yes, God is capable. What he doesn't know is God determined? God can do it. Will God choose to do it? God's capable. Is he determined? And in saying that, Ezekiel is basically asking the same question that thousands of years later, a young second grader would ask right before watching a video of Chadwick Boseman. What is the nature of the world? Is the world a cold, hard, dead place? Or is it possible that God is doing something different in the world? Almost 600 years following the story of Ezekiel, where he's in this valley of dry bones, and God says, can I bring these dry bones back to life? He says, only you know. And God actually does it. God puts the bones back together, and then he starts to see muscles and sinews and tendons come to place, and flesh comes to these bones. And then the Spirit of the Lord, a wind blows through and gives these bones life again. And God shows Ezekiel that not only is he capable, but he is determined. What kind of God is God? And God shows Ezekiel, I am the God of new life. I am the God who will overcome death. That's the kind of God I am. And so Jesus stands in front of this giant temple in Jerusalem some 600 years later, and Jesus answers them, destroy this temple, and I will raise it again in 3 days. And they replied, it has taken 46 years to build this temple, and you are going to raise it in 3 days? But the temple he had spoken of was his body, and they just weren't able to see it because they were wrestling with the question, what is the nature of the world? And by this point, the people who Jesus is talking to had his Israelite brothers and sisters. They'd been conquered by the Babylonians, they'd been conquered by the Assyrians, they'd been conquered by Greece, they'd been conquered by Rome. You start to feel after a while that there's just been so much death and destruction, and we can't possibly look at death and see the possibility for new life anymore. You can't raise this temple in 3 days. And if you're talking about a body, you certainly can't do that, because they bought into the belief that the world was essentially a cold, hard, dead place. Life is tough. And then you die. But that's not what Jesus taught. That's not what Jesus believed. In fact, what Jesus taught was that God had sent him not to overcome their enemies of Rome, but that God had sent him, the Son of God, to take their place and die the death that they were headed toward. It was only through Jesus dying that death, Jesus taking the sin, the destruction, the horror of the world upon himself, upon a cross. It was only in doing that and letting it fully kill him, and then raising from that death, that he was able to overcome that death. This death that had plagued humans, both in this life and in the one to come, for millennia and millennia, Jesus was willing to walk in and to take that death upon himself, and as the Son of God, to overcome it through the resurrection. But his followers just couldn't understand that. After he is crucified, he's executed, he's murdered by the Roman Empire and by the Jewish religious establishment, his disciples think it's all over. It's done. There's nothing else. They scatter, in fact, because they're fearful. They got Jesus. We never thought they'd be able to get him. We thought he would overcome them, but they got him. So of course they're going to get us. We don't have any kind of that power that Jesus has. So they run, they're scattered, they're afraid. And if that were the end of the story, we wouldn't be talking about it still. But in Luke 24, we read this. On the first day of the week, very early in the morning, the women took the spices they had prepared and they went to the tomb. And they found the stone rolled away from the tomb, but when they entered, they did not find the body of the Lord Jesus. And while they were wondering about this, suddenly two men in clothes that gleamed like lightning stood beside them. I would love to have clothes like that. I have looked. They do not sell them at the mall. In their fright, the women bowed down with their faces to the ground, but the men said to them, "Why do you look for the living among the dead?" And by the way, as we read the rest of this verse, it's okay to get a little excited. Why do you look for the living among the dead? He is not here. He is risen. That's the proclamation. And then they go on to remind them of why that is. He says, remember how he told you while he was still with you in Galilee, that the Son of Man must be delivered over to the hands of sinners, be crucified, and on the third day be raised again. And then they remembered the words. What are the words that they remembered? He talked about this in several places and in several times, but certainly part of what they remember is destroy this temple and I'll rebuild it. In fact, in John 22, shortly after he makes that proclamation, John tells us after he was raised from the dead, his disciples recalled what he had said. Then they believed the scripture and the words that Jesus had spoken. Destroy this temple and I'll rebuild it. Life overcoming death. And see, that's what the resurrection of Jesus points to. It answers the question, what is the nature of this world? Is the world a cold, hard, dead place? And the resurrection of Jesus pushes back against that assumption and says, like, no, wherever there is death, you will see God working, bringing new life and bringing restoration and bringing reconciliation. And if you want proof of that, look no further than the empty tomb. That's what the resurrection points us to. And if ever there's been a year in my lifetime where we could hear good news and where we need good news about the possibility for new life springing up from dead life, from restoration and reconciliation springing up from exhaustion and anxiety, perhaps this is the year. My mom and my dad live in East Texas. And they have some land there that's been in my family for a really long time. And land in East Texas, like, Southern California, we think of land like having half an acre, you're basically wealthy. In East Texas, land's about 12 cents an acre. They just almost give it away like it's not a problem. So my parents live on some acreage. And the pandemic's been hard because they have some land, like they don't have neighbors that they can wave at or see. Like they see no signs of life basically for this last year. They both have pre-existing conditions that made them, pretty concerned about the possibility of getting COVID-19. My mom's a cancer survivor. My dad has had respiratory issues his entire life. And so they've been really cautious this last year, which also means they've been really isolated this last year. So I've tried to call them more than normal just to hear how they're doing and to hear what they're up to. And because they're just kind of hanging around there and taking care of the property, like they're not up to much. But occasionally my dad will tell me about the latest adventures he's had of getting rid of, woodland pests or things that are annoying them. A few months ago, I called and he told me, this is probably back in November or December, that they had found an armadillo out in the yard. Now, armadillos, because most of you probably aren't super familiar, obviously they're adorable. I mean, much cuter than cats at least, but armadillos are these creatures that they will tear up your yard. They just dig all kinds of holes in the ground. And so my dad got his armadillo gun. He has a gun really just for armadillos, and he took it out to get rid of the armadillo. And armadillos, as a defense mechanism, will jump. Like they'll leap pretty high in the air, like much higher than you think they will. And it was getting, like the sun had already gone down, and it was kind of hard to see. So my dad goes out and he's looking for the armadillo because he saw him in the backyard. Then he sees him and he's pretty close to him. He's like 5-6 feet from him. So he shoots the armadillo, and the armadillo jumps up in the air. And as the armadillo jumps up after being shot, blood just starts squirting all over my dad. Like he said, it just keeps coming and coming and coming. He said, I felt like I must look like Stephen King's Carrie at the prom, like just totally stoked. And I was like, oh, it's disgusting. Oh, what is happening? And then he realized, I shot the water hose. That's water. That's okay. Like, that's not a big deal. Didn't kill the armadillo, but that hose will never bother anyone again, right? Like, and then a couple weeks after that, there was a woodpecker on our property that thought my dad's metal shed was wood apparently, and was just going to town on the metal shed like all day, it seemed like, all night. Like it was driving them crazy. So he took his armadillo gun and he went out to take care of the woodpecker. And as he's just about to fire, there's this group of blackbirds that are flying over his head, and he fires at the woodpecker, and apparently it scares all the blackbirds, and they all poop on him at the same time. So sometimes I just call my dad just to check in and say, like, hey, how's it going? Has anything pooped or bled on you this week? Like, it's a good question to ask. My dad calls me in January, just a few months ago. And I said, like, hey, how's it going? You know, it's jovial at the start and everything. And he says, hey, Josh, I got something kind of serious to share with you. My dad's brother is Jim. And my Uncle Jim has just been a huge influence on my life for as long as I can remember. He's been kind of like a second dad to me. He took me fishing when I was younger. He would talk to me about life. He helped me out with some homework assignments I still remember from 2nd and 3rd grade. He just always had time for me. And Jim's in his early 70s, and so I was thinking, like, I would have lots of time with Jim over the next 5, 10, 15, 20 years, like, no problem. My dad says, hey, your Uncle Jim just found out he has 3 types of cancer. And it's in 3 different places on his body, and in a couple of places, there's not much they can do. And they think he may have 3 or 4 months to live. It's possible he could live longer. It's possible he can make it to 6 months, a year, even 2 years is possible. But we just don't really know what's going to happen. After a hard year, it was a hard thing to know. And at first, I was just completely rocked. And I talked to my wife about it. I couldn't stop crying when I was talking to her. I was able to talk to my Uncle Jim just a week later or so on the phone and just tell him how much I cared about him and loved him. And then my brother and I started kind of asking the question, like, you know, he may not have a pulse much longer, but we'll be reunited with him in eternity one day. That's the promise of Jesus. But even before then, what does resurrection look like now? What does it look like to breathe new life into this situation, this dark valley that we're walking through together? And so a few weeks ago, my brother and his wife came in from Colorado, and I flew in from California, and we just spent the week. Every night we'd have dinner with my Uncle Jim, and we'd talk to him, we'd share stories, and we'd just have a great time. And then every day we would go over to his house and we'd repaint and we'd refloor and we'd do a bunch of other things I am terrible at, but my dad is good at, and he can give me good instruction. And that's just what we did every single day. And at the end of that week, Jim just asked my dad, like, why would they come all this way to work all this time all week? And my dad just said, well, they love you. And this is what life springing up in the midst of death looks like. You see, there is an unexpected, mysterious presence that meets us in our lowest moments. When we have no left strength, when we have nothing left to give, there is a voice that calls out across the centuries with the simple statement that if we have ears to hear, we can take it in. Destroy this temple, and I'll rebuild it. Do we believe that? See, that's the question that Jesus asked then, and that's the question that Jesus asked now. Jesus' friends show up at the tomb, and there's an angel there who says, he is not here. Ha! You didn't see that coming, did you? He is not here, and you have nothing to fear, and nothing will ever be the same, because there is no impossible circumstance that has ever stopped the work of God from going forward. Jesus says, this is how it's going to go. They are going to take my life from me, but that will not be the end. And so for those of us who are afraid, for those of us who are fearful, for those of us who feel like life is broken and busted, and I'm not sure if it can ever be put back together again, when you find yourself in that place, just pause for a moment and recognize that through the resurrection of Jesus Christ, new life might actually be poured into what feels like death for you right now. That through the resurrection of Jesus Christ, things may in fact have just begun.
Let's stand up and sing together. Hey, Saturday was silent, surely it was through. But since when has impossible ever stopped you? Friday's disappointment, Sunday's empty tomb. Since the sound of dry bones rattling. Come on. This is the praise, make a dead man walk again. Open the grave, I'm coming out. I'm gonna live again. This is the sound of dry bones rattling. Pentecostal fire, let's lift our voices up. Pentecostal fire, burning something new. You're not gonna run out of miracles anytime soon. Resurrection power runs in my veins too, yeah. I believe there's another miracle here in this room. This is the sound of dry bones rattling. This is the praise, make a dead man walk again. Open the grave, I'm coming out. I'm gonna live again. This is the sound of dry bones rattling. My God is able to save and to heal and to store and restore anything that he wants to, yeah. Just ask the man who was thrown on the bones of Elijah.